welcome back. We're continuing our dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. In our last video, we talked about what it means to be dynamic when we also derived the aggregate demand curve. You might think that where we're going to go next is the aggregate supply. We're actually going to take a detour to include a third curve. So I mentioned in the last video there are actually three curves that are associated with this. So this is where it starts to look a little bit different than the demand and supply models you saw at the beginning of the semester. Okay, so first, let's start back with where we left off. Dynamic, we had a labeling of the axes in which our inflation rate is our y-axis variable and our real GDP growth rate is our x-axis variable. Then from there, we derived a aggregate demand curve that's associated with a fixed level of spending growth. Okay, and in that example, we had aggregate demand associated with a money supply growth rate plus a velocity growth rate, aka a spending growth rate of 5%. Okay. All right. I'm not going to label any of the axes just yet, with coordinates, because I want to introduce a new curve, and it's called the long run aggregate supply curve. So long run aggregate supply curve. And this brings forth what we might call the solo growth model. And in the solo growth model, it would tell you that real GDP growth is a function of A, which represents the level of technology, knowledge, and about how to do things, K, the level of capital, and L, the amount of labor. Or in other words, the factors of production. We're not going to work too much with this model, but what I want you to get from this is that there is a real growth rate that's known as the solo growth rate. And it's independent of inflation. Okay? So that's the key feature right there. Okay, so if you want to show a curve that is the same value no matter what the inflation rate is, what kind of curve do you think you would get? If the level of real growth is based on the factors of production in the long run, and in the long run it's independent of the inflation rate, then we're going to have some level of real GDP growth. Let's say it's 3%, and it's going to be 3% whether we have a 2% inflation rate, 4% inflation rate, or 5% inflation rate. And so we could draw a vertical line straight up to get our long run aggregate supply, and it's associated with a solo growth rate of 3%. Okay. So with just these two curves, we can get an equilibrium that corresponds to a popular macroeconomic theory known as the real business cycle theory. And their attempt is to explain business fluctuations by real shocks to technology, to capital, or labor. Okay, and it fundamentally causes a fluctuation economy independent of printing money or changes in spending. Okay, and so if we do this, we can have a positive shock, a shift to the right, such as the boom from the internet, or a negative shock from a natural disaster. I'm going to pick a more current event, the coronavirus pandemic. Okay. And so if we had a negative real shock, first we need to start with where we're starting at. So remember, we started at 3% growth rate, and we need to make sure that 3 plus the inflation rate is equal to the spending growth rate of 5%. And so this must be an inflation rate of 2%. Okay. All right, so in this real business cycle theory, we could say that we could have a negative productivity shock. So negative productivity shock that would shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the left. And so we could say that this is 0% here. Let's make it negative. Let's say negative 1%. Okay. So in order for this equation to balance out, then our inflation rate must be higher. And the scale's not quite perfect here, but it still does the job here. So if we add a 6% inflation rate plus a negative 1% real GDP growth rate, then we'll still have that spending growth of 5%. Okay. Now, you might have thought, well, if the economy is producing less, wouldn't we also spend less? And you'd be right to assume that, because what would be following this situation would be a negative aggregate demand shock, okay? And so you might say, well, you know, if this is what happened, we would see negative growth and an increase in inflation. But that's not what we're seeing right now. We're seeing actually probably a lower than 2% inflation rate. And so let's just say that it's in reality at 1%. Okay. So if this is our new long-run aggregate supply curve, then we must also have a shift left of the aggregate demand curve to match that. Okay. So this will be our new aggregate demand curve. And it's associated with the spending growth rate. Well, if you take the inflation rate of 1% and you add to it negative 1%, you have a spending growth rate of 0. So at this point, spending growth has essentially frozen. Okay. So the spending level has not decreased or increased. It's just kind of flat at this level when we have a spending growth rate of 0%. Okay. And so given that we had a spending growth rate of 5% before, we would still call this a negative AD shock. Or maybe it might be better to say it's a negative aggregate demand response. Okay. All right. So what happened here? We had a shift left of the long-run aggregate supply curve due to a disaster like the coronavirus pandemic, and then that decrease in productivity was also followed by a decrease in the spending growth rate. And so we went from A to B to C. Okay. All right, so this is the long-run aggregate supply curve, and if you just have these two curves together, so if you just have AD and long-run aggregate supply, then you have what we call the real business cycle theory. All right. So in the next video, we'll be actually talking about our aggregate supply curve. In other words, our short-run aggregate supply curve. So yes, there are two supply curves to help us understand business fluctuations. All right, see you at the next video.